Hey, what's up, Lakeside? My name's Cole Harper. I'm one of the pastors here, and I am bringing you the live streams in Dry Places devotional today. I'll be doing it from Mark chapter 6, and I'll tell you right now, the big idea of what I'm going to be talking about is this. Sometimes Jesus sends us into danger so that we'll know him better. Sometimes Jesus sends us into danger, do with that what you will, so that we'll know him better, okay? I've heard things like that a lot, just in my time, as a Christian, as a believer, and, sometimes it makes sense to me, other times it doesn't, but I always had this suspicion that, is this just something like church people say? Because they sort of don't know what to do with, why bad stuff happens to people just trying to do their best. But Mark chapter 6 really, it doesn't give a satisfying answer, but it gives an answer that has what I like to call a high explanatory yield. It makes sense of a lot of data in our lives. So let me read Mark chapter 6 for you, verses 45 through 52, okay? And all this is getting at this idea that Jesus will sometimes send us into danger so we'll know him better, okay? Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida. That's the Sea of Galilee we're talking about here. While he dismissed the crowd. So after leaving them, Jesus went up on a mountainside to pray. Okay, and this is where stuff gets really bizarre. Pick it up at verse 47. When evening came, the boat that the disciples were in was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. And he saw, check this out, he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, we'll explain what that means in a second. About the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for the disciples, they had not understood about the loaves that Jesus had multiplied, and their hearts were hardened. Sometimes Jesus sends us into danger or really, really hard circumstances so that we'll know him better. And that's not just made up Christian urban legend. It's actually true. A few things to note just out of this quick story. Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. Jesus goes, I'm going to go pray on a mountain, and he puts them in a boat, sends them off, and says, best of luck, chaps, and waits for the inevitable to happen. That's a lot to take in there. Did you notice, too, that while this passage says they're struggling with the oars, trying to make headway across the Sea of Galilee, Jesus is watching them in real time, like from his little mountain. So he's looking off to the distance and he sees his disciples like trying to make headway with the wind totally against them, the waves coming up over the boat, all that jazz. And Jesus is just checking it out. He's just watching it, right? It's bizarre. There's no way around that. And then what the text says is later, around the fourth watch, what that means like to modern readers is somewhere between like 4 and 6 o'clock in the morning. What you have is Jesus watching his disciples struggle and freak out on the sea, just letting it happen from the evening, so around sundown, 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., Jesus is still letting them struggle. 11 p.m., hey Jerry, 12 p.m., or 12 a.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m. He's letting hours go by as they try in vain to keep themselves from capsizing and trying to get to the other side of the lake. But then, and only then, right, Jesus walks out to them. It says, he was about to pass by them when they saw him walking on the lake, and they thought he was a ghost. What's really crazy here, too, is when Mark says Jesus was going to pass by them, on the Sea of Galilee, walking on it, he's making an allusion to a really Old Testament story in the book of Exodus. Remember when Moses asked God to let him see his glory, and God basically says, well, I don't want to kill you, so what I'll do, you turn your back to me in like this cleft of a rock, and I will pass by you. That's the same idea that's being communicated here. Mark he wants you to think of that. So, in one sense, when all that light passed by Moses in Exodus to reveal who God was to him, that's what this experience is supposed to do to the disciples. Jesus is going to pass by them. But he's not going to do it in the serene, tranquility of being up on a mountain. Instead, Jesus came off the mountain to walk to them on a storm-tossed sea and is going to pass by them like that. And when they see Jesus, it's not like they were comforted at first. They literally thought he was a ghost. When Jesus stepped in and intervened in their situation, he showed up looking like a ghost on the water. And I don't know about you guys, but that has happened to me quite a lot. I've asked God to intervene, like show up and show off, kick butt, take names, that kind of thing. And even when God does make himself known, sometimes it's kind of freaky. Sometimes I don't know what to do with it. That's kind of where the disciples are at. So Jesus gets in the boat, Mark says, and immediately the wind died down as a result, for they had not understood about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. And part of what Mark's saying is here, the disciples' hearts were hardened right now, too. Even though this was supposed to tell them who Jesus was. Some of the imagery was probably lost on them, right? You get in books like Job or other passages in the Old Testament, Yahweh or God is seen as the one who, quote, tramples on the waves, who walks upon the chaos and the turbulence of this undifferentiated source of anarchy and turbulence. That's what Yahweh is known for in the Old Testament, and that's what God in Jesus is doing here. They didn't make that connection. They thought he was a ghost, and their hearts were hardened. What's weird is it's not clear that all the disciples' reactions to Jesus were the same. Matthew records the same event, and has, this is where Peter gets out on the boat and walks on the water a little bit and falls down when he sees the waves. I think they end up worshiping him in that passage somewhat. John tells it a little differently too, but what you often see with the disciples is that certain ones make connections faster or slower than others, but they're not always on the same page. Sometimes their understanding of what's going on and what Jesus is doing is evolving. And I think we're in the same boat sometimes. Jesus will send us into danger and say, bon voyage, I'll see you in a few hours, and let us struggle against the storm so that our energies and our probably our other sources of confidence, other than Jesus himself, are spent, and then he shows up, not really in the nick of time, but way after we would have liked him to show. And so if that happens to you, it doesn't mean he's abandoned you. The 12 themselves had this sort of thing happen to them. I think what we got to take away from that is, with God and his economy, the way Jesus interacts with us, difficulty, turmoil, and danger are curated by Jesus in such a way that it will produce the exact circumstances we can see him clearly, see him in the way we need to see him in a way we haven't done to that point. And it's not always clear how we're going to react to that. Maybe you've had times where you react with a little bit of both. You worship, but you're also kind of angry and a little ticked off that he let those things happen. I think if you find yourself in that kind of situation, the best thing you can do is to align your experience with those in the faith who came before you and remind yourself that this must work toward your good in the long run. And it doesn't mean you have to know how. People are complicated. You're complicated. It's not a guaranteed result that you're going to react to God and Jesus as he reveals himself to you appropriately. That's just not a guarantee. What we can do ahead of time is recognize that the instruments like this, like a storm, are part of God's sort of instrument bag he will use to let us see exactly who he is. In this case, it was the God who tramples the waves. Maybe in your case, it's the God who tramples the markets. Or it's that God is the one who tramples cancer or viruses. You know, the one thing you can bank on in your experience following Jesus is that he'll use everything he's sent you into to make himself more clearly known to you. And that's the sign of a good father, not the sign of someone who abandons their children. God's a father, and he'll let things happen to you that will help you understand in the long run who he is for you and just what he's capable of. C.S. Lewis famously said that adventures are never fun when you're having them. But there's a kind of sweetness and almost a nostalgia when we look back and we can see how God clearly revealed his character, his power, his identity to us through circumstances he tailor-made for us and then sent us into. And in the fullness of time, that big expanse of hours that he just watched us on a mountain till the fourth watch of the night struggle against wave and wind, I think that'll take on a kind of sweetness as well. I still have a few experiences from my life, I don't know about you guys, that I'm still waiting for clarity on. You know, there are a lot of trials I have where I feel pretty confident on why God let that happen. There are others, I'll be frank, there's still a question mark by them. I haven't quite figured it out yet. But if I can process it from the standpoint of he was teaching me something about his nature, it'll help clarify the lessons I'm supposed to draw from it and the lessons I'm not supposed to draw from it. So, all right, my phone's blown up. I'm getting a bunch of texts. I got to go anyway. I love you guys. Jesus is actually watching over you right now. He's not staying on the mountain because he's cruel. He may wait till the fourth watch of the night when you are exhausted. But he will make himself known to you. And that might scare you at first. You may mistake him for a ghost. That's okay. Keep your mind on the long run. That he intends to reveal pieces of himself that wouldn't be accessible to you otherwise without wind or tempest. All right, go get them. Take names, guys. Bye.